The air here is thin enough to make a healthy person stumble after climbing a single flight of stairs. At an average elevation of more than 4,500 meters above sea level, the Tibetan Plateau stretches across the roof of the world. A vast, wind-scoured wilderness of permafrost, alpine grassland, and silence so complete it has a texture of its own. Yaks move slowly across the tundra, their breath rising in pale clouds that dissolve almost instantly in the dry, crystalline air. The sky above is a deeper blue than most people will ever see in their lives, because at this altitude, there is simply less atmosphere between you and space. Light arrives here unfiltered and absolute, casting shadows so sharp they look painted onto the ground. This is where China chose to build a railway. Not a short commuter line, not a modest regional connection threading between two nearby cities. The Qinghai-Tibet Railway runs for 1,956 kilometers from the city of Xining in Qinghai Province, all the way to Lhasa, the ancient capital of Tibet. For 960 kilometers of that distance, nearly half the entire route, the line sits above 4,000 meters elevation. The Tanggula Pass, the highest point on the railway, reaches 5,072 meters above sea level, making it the highest railway pass on Earth. No other passenger railway in history has ever climbed this high, or stayed this high, for this long. Standing at the Tanggula station, the highest railway station on the planet, a person with no prior acclimatization will feel the altitude within minutes. A dull pressure behind the eyes, a slight unreality, as though the world has become subtly less substantial than it should be. To understand why this railway was built, you have to understand the particular geography of isolation that has defined Tibet for all of recorded history. Tibet has been physically separated from the rest of China, and from the rest of the world, by some of the most impassable terrain the planet has produced. To the south, the Himalayan range forms a wall that includes the highest mountain on Earth. To the east and north, deep river gorges, high passes, and the sheer geological mass of the Kunlun and Tanggula mountain ranges created a natural barrier that for centuries made overland travel into Lhasa an expedition measured not in days, but in months. Caravans of traders and pilgrims had been crossing the plateau for 1,000 years along routes that demanded extraordinary endurance. Routes where altitude sickness and violent weather were accepted as part of the price of passage. Before the railway, the main overland connection was the Qinghai-Tibet Highway, constructed in the 1950s by the People's Liberation Army, using a labor force that included both soldiers and civilians working under conditions of extreme hardship. That road was a genuine achievement for its time, but it remained a rough, punishing track that closed regularly in winter, that demanded days of driving across terrain that broke down vehicles with monotonous regularity, and that could never carry the volume of goods a growing population required. Freight arrived in Lhasa expensively and slowly. The cost of that distance was paid by ordinary people every day, in the price of goods, in the difficulty of travel, in the persistent sense of being cut off from the larger world. The idea of a railway to Lhasa is older than most people realize. Chinese engineers first surveyed possible routes as far back as the 1930s, when the Republic of China government identified a Tibetan railway as a long-term infrastructure ambition. After the People's Republic was established in 1949, the project was discussed with renewed seriousness in the 1950s. But every technical assessment reached the same conclusion. The engineering barriers were beyond what the available knowledge and materials could overcome. The permafrost, the altitude, the seismic activity, the remoteness of the construction zone from any supply base. Each of these challenges was severe on its own. Together, they formed a wall that the engineering profession of that era could not climb. The line from Xining to Golmud, the first 814 kilometers of the route, crossing terrain that was difficult but not impossible, was completed in 1984. For nearly 2 decades, it served as a terminus, a railhead at the edge of the impossible, where freight transferred to trucks and passengers stepped off into the thin air and continued by road. Engineers and planners looked south from Golmud toward the plateau that stretched beyond and continued to reach the same verdict. Not yet. The permafrost problem alone, they believed, was potentially unsolvable with existing methods, and the permafrost was only one of several problems. Permanently frozen ground covers approximately 550 kilometers of the Golmud to Lhasa section, roughly 85% of the most technically demanding portion of the entire route. Permafrost is not simply frozen soil in the way that a puddle freezes overnight. It is a geological structure formed over thousands of years, in some places hundreds of meters deep, a matrix of ice and mineral particles that has reached a kind of equilibrium with the temperatures that surround it. When that equilibrium is disturbed, when the ground above it is cleared of insulating vegetation, when heat from a road surface or a building foundation begins to penetrate downward, the permafrost thaws. And when permafrost thaws, it does not simply become soft ground. The ice that was holding the mineral particles together melts, and the structure collapses. Ground that was solid becomes a slow, cold slurry. Whatever was built on top of it tilts, sinks, and eventually fails. Sections of the Qinghai-Tibet Highway had demonstrated this process in the most unambiguous possible terms over decades of operation. Stretches of road that were level one summer would be visibly deformed by the following spring. Repairs were constant, expensive, and temporary. The ground beneath was simply not stable in any permanent sense. A railway is far less forgiving than a road. The geometric precision required for safe, high-speed train operation means that even small deformations in the track bed can cause serious problems. A truck can navigate a surface that has shifted a few centimeters without the driver necessarily noticing. A passenger train traveling at 100 kilometers per hour cannot tolerate the same tolerance. The engineers who were asked to design the Golmud to Lhasa section understood from the very first technical meeting that permafrost was not a secondary problem to be managed around the edges of an otherwise conventional railway project. It was the central challenge, the one that had to be solved before any of the other problems could even be approached. Construction of the Golmud to Lhasa section was officially approved in February of 2001. The project was placed under the authority of the Chinese Ministry of Railways, and the engineering work was led by teams from multiple institutions, including the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which had been studying Tibetan permafrost conditions for decades and had accumulated a body of knowledge that proved essential to the project's eventual success. The initial budget was set at 26.2 billion yuan. The planned completion date was the year 2007. At the peak of construction, more than 100,000 workers were employed simultaneously across the construction zone. The permafrost solution that the engineers ultimately developed involved not one approach, but three distinct strategies, applied according to the specific conditions at each location along the route. The first strategy, used in areas where the permafrost was deep and relatively stable, was to build the track on raised embankments packed with carefully engineered layers of insulating material and, crucially, crushed rock. The crushed rock layer functions as a passive cooling system based on a principle that is elegant in its simplicity. In winter, cold air descends through the gaps between the rocks, penetrating deep into the embankment and cooling the ground beneath. The rock's irregular structure allows this circulation to proceed efficiently. In summer, the same structure prevents warm air from moving through as freely, because warm air does not descend naturally, it rises. The net effect over a full year is a cooling of the ground beneath the embankment that offsets the warming influence of the dark track surface above, keeping the permafrost layer frozen through seasons that would otherwise destabilize it. In areas where the permafrost was less reliably stable, or where temperature monitoring suggested that warming trends were already underway, engineers deployed a technology that looks almost impossibly simple for the scale of the problem it was asked to solve: thermosiphons. A thermosiphon is a sealed steel tube, typically several meters long, filled with liquid ammonia. When the air temperature outside drops in winter, the ammonia at the bottom of the tube absorbs heat from the surrounding ground. It vaporizes and rises to the top of the tube, which extends above the embankment surface into the cold air. At the top, the heat is released into the atmosphere, and the ammonia condenses back into liquid, falling to the bottom to begin the cycle again. No pumps, no electricity, no moving parts of any kind. Just the physics of phase change, working silently and continuously through every cold night on the plateau, extracting warmth from the earth and releasing it into the air, maintaining the frozen state of the permafrost beneath the tracks. More than 36,000 thermosiphon units were installed along the railway, one of the largest deployments of this technology for infrastructure protection anywhere in the world. The third strategy was the most dramatic. Where ground conditions were simply too unstable for any surface construction to be viable, the engineers lifted the railway off the ground entirely. Concrete viaducts, elevated bridges, carry the track above the surface on piers whose foundations are drilled deep into stable bedrock far below the permafrost layer, bypassing the problem zone entirely. The railway includes 343 bridges, with a combined length of more than 159 kilometers. The longest of the dedicated permafrost avoidance viaducts stretches for more than 11 kilometers across a zone of particularly unstable high-altitude wetland near the Qinghai River. At the time of its construction, one of the longest railway bridges in China. The oxygen problem shadowed every other technical challenge and imposed constraints that had no real precedent in railway construction. At 5,000 meters, the atmospheric pressure is roughly half what it is at sea level. Each breath a worker took contained approximately half the oxygen available to a worker at low altitude. Acclimatization, the process by which the body adjusts to reduced oxygen availability by producing more red blood cells and adjusting its chemistry, takes days to weeks and is never fully complete for the most demanding physical labor. Acute altitude sickness, which ranges in severity from painful headaches and nausea to, in the most serious cases, dangerous fluid accumulation in the lungs or brain, is a medical emergency that cannot be predicted from a person's age, fitness level, or prior altitude experience. Workers were screened for medical fitness before being deployed to high-altitude construction sites. Acclimatization periods were built into deployment schedules, with workers spending time at intermediate elevations before being sent to the highest sections. Supplemental oxygen was available at all work sites and required at the most demanding locations. More than 140 medical stations and clinics were established along the construction route, staffed by doctors and nurses who dealt constantly with altitude-related illness and whose response times to emergencies were measured in the brutal arithmetic of distance and thin air. The logistics of maintaining a workforce of more than 100,000 people in one of the most medically challenging environments on Earth, while simultaneously managing the technical complexity of the construction itself, represented a feat of organizational engineering that received far less attention than the bridge designs and permafrost solutions, but was no less remarkable. For the workers who spent months or years on the plateau, the experience was defined by something more than hardship. These were men, engineers trained in Beijing and Shanghai, laborers recruited from the farming provinces of Sichuan and Hunan and Gansu, who found themselves living inside a landscape that the vast majority of humanity will never visit. The light on the plateau in the late afternoon takes on a quality that is difficult to describe to someone who has not seen it. A golden, almost horizontal luminescence that makes the grassland glow and turns distant mountains into something that looks more like a painting than a place. At night, removed from any city by hundreds of kilometers, the stars are so numerous and so bright that they cast faint shadows. Workers reported that the scale of the landscape, its emptiness, its indifference, its geological age made visible in every direction, created a persistent low-level sense of vertigo that had nothing to do with altitude. The world outside the construction camp was simply larger than the human mind was built to accommodate comfortably. The construction imposed environmental requirements that were, for a Chinese infrastructure project of this era and this scale, unusually specific and seriously enforced. The Hoshil region, which the railway crosses in its most remote section, is one of the most ecologically important nature reserves in China, and was designated a United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization World Heritage Site in 2017, in part because of its role as breeding habitat for the Tibetan antelope. Known locally as the chiru, the Tibetan antelope had been devastated by industrial-scale poaching in the 1980s and 90s, when demand for the ultrafine fiber of their underwool drove hunters to slaughter herds numbering in the tens of thousands. By the time railway construction began, populations had declined to levels that conservationists considered dangerously low. The railway design incorporated 33 dedicated wildlife passages, tunnels and underpasses of varying dimensions, sized and positioned according to the behavioral patterns of different species, allowing large mammals to cross beneath the embankment without being blocked or deflected by the railway infrastructure. Construction was suspended at certain sensitive locations during the peak of the antelope migration season. Drainage systems from construction camps were managed to prevent contamination of the plateau's watershed, which feeds rivers that supply water to a significant portion of the Asian continent downstream. The Fenghuoshan Tunnel deserves particular attention among the many engineering achievements of the project. At an elevation of 4,905 meters, it is the highest railway tunnel in the world. It is 1,338 meters long, not extraordinary in length by the standards of tunnel engineering, but extraordinary in the conditions under which it was bored. Workers inside the tunnel during drilling were operating with less than 60% of the oxygen available at sea level, while also managing the heat, noise, and dust of active tunnel excavation. Portable oxygen equipment was worn continuously. Shifts were shortened relative to standard tunnel work to limit cumulative exposure to the physiological stress. The frozen rock presented additional complications. Drilling generates heat, which melts the ice bonded into the rock structure, which then refreezes unpredictably as temperatures drop, distorting the tunnel lining and requiring constant assessment and reinforcement. Every meter of progress through the Fenghuoshan Tunnel was earned against resistance that standard tunnel engineering had never been required to calculate. The railway opened for revenue service on the 1st of July 2006, a full year ahead of the original planned completion date. First trains departed simultaneously from Xining and from Lhasa on a date the Chinese government had chosen with evident care for its symbolic resonance: the 85th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. Premier Wen Jiabao rode one of the inaugural services, and celebrations were organized in both Lhasa and Beijing. Within days of the opening, every available seat on every scheduled train was sold. The latent demand, the decades of suppressed movement, the freight that had waited for a viable route, the passengers who had wanted to travel but could not afford the time or cost of the alternatives, came flooding in immediately and overwhelmingly. The trains themselves required engineering adaptations as original as anything in the track and bridge design. Standard passenger railway cars cannot safely operate at high altitude. The passenger cabins of Qinghai-Tibet Railway rolling stock are hermetically sealed and pressurized, maintaining an interior oxygen concentration equivalent to an altitude of roughly 2,500 meters, regardless of the elevation outside the window. Supplemental oxygen is delivered directly to each seat through individual outlets, a system borrowed from commercial aviation and adapted for railway use. The windows incorporate ultraviolet filtering glass to protect passengers from the solar radiation that arrives at these elevations with significantly greater intensity than at sea level, where the atmosphere absorbs a much larger fraction of the ultraviolet spectrum. The locomotives were produced through a collaboration between the Canadian manufacturer Bombardier Transportation and Chinese partners, and were comprehensively modified for high-altitude operation. Cooling systems were enhanced to function in the thinner air, which is a less effective coolant than the denser air at low altitude. The operating temperature range spans from -40 degrees Celsius in the depths of winter on the northern plateau to +30 degrees Celsius in summer, a range of 70 degrees within which all systems must function reliably. The braking systems were redesigned to handle the long, sustained descents from the plateau, where conventional braking on steep grades over extended distances would overheat standard braking equipment. The result was a new class of vehicle, engineered for a set of conditions that had never before been specified for passenger railway operation anywhere on Earth. The impact on Lhasa was immediate and tangible. Before the railway, virtually all goods arrived by truck, an expensive, unreliable supply chain that kept consumer prices significantly higher than in comparable Chinese cities and made shortages of basic goods a routine fact of life. Within the first full year of railway operation, the cost of staple goods in Lhasa fell measurably as freight volumes increased dramatically. Construction materials, steel, cement, glass, manufactured goods of every kind, arrived in quantities that accelerated building projects across the Tibetan Autonomous Region. The tourism sector, which had always been constrained partly by the simple difficulty of reaching the plateau affordably, expanded with a speed that surprised even optimistic projections. The economic and political dimensions of the railway are impossible to discuss honestly without acknowledging that they have been and remain deeply contested. Critics, including Tibetan exile organizations, international human rights groups, and a range of independent scholars, argued from the project's announcement that its primary function was to facilitate the demographic and cultural transformation of Tibet by dramatically lowering the barriers to Han Chinese migration and settlement in a region where Tibetan identity and culture had historically defined the population. The railway, these critics argued, was not primarily a development project but a political instrument, designed to bind Tibet more tightly into the Chinese nation by filling the physical space between them with infrastructure. The Chinese government described the project consistently in terms of poverty reduction, economic development, and the basic fairness of providing Tibetan citizens with the same modern infrastructure available to people in other parts of the country. These competing frameworks have never been reconciled, and the railway continues to carry the weight of both narratives every day that it operates. What is not contested by any party is the scale of the technical achievement. Engineering institutions that have examined the project in detail, without political stake in its meaning, have consistently described it as one of the most demanding infrastructure projects ever successfully completed. No single one of its challenges was without precedent, but the combination of all of them, simultaneously, across nearly 1,000 kilometers of terrain that was remote from any supply base and hostile to human habitation, had no precedent anywhere in the history of railway engineering. Solutions that worked in Siberia did not translate directly to the Tibetan plateau. Methods proven in the Alps did not account for the altitude. Every answer had to be built from first principles, tested against conditions that were in some cases observed for the first time during the construction process itself. On a clear morning in Lhasa, the railway station sits at the edge of the city like a threshold between two versions of the world. Passengers descend from the train after nearly 22 hours of travel from Xining, stepping out into air that is bright and dry and impossibly clear, carrying the faint scent of juniper smoke that has perfumed Lhasa's streets for centuries. The mountains to the north are so sharp against the sky that they seem to exist in a different visual register than everything in the foreground. Too defined, too close, too enormous to be real. The sensors buried along the railway embankment continue to transmit their readings every hour. Soil temperature, moisture content, the slow data of the frozen ground as it responds to seasons and to the longer, slower warming that is reshaping the plateau's climate in ways that will eventually require new engineering answers. The thermosiphons work through the cold nights without anyone watching. The antelope move across the grassland where the underpasses wait for them below the tracks, worn smooth by years of cautious crossings. And somewhere between Golmud and Lhasa, on a section of track that rides 5,000 meters above the sea on a bed of crushed rock and frozen earth and stubborn human ingenuity, a train is moving through a landscape that asked every question the engineering profession knew how to answer, and several that it had never been asked before. The answers it required exist now, encoded in concrete and steel and the quiet physics of sealed tubes, running through the highest and most improbable railway on Earth. Proof of something that is simultaneously obvious and astonishing. That when a civilization decides something must be done, the definition of impossible tends to shift.